They found them on a Tuesday morning in late September, 1963. Two girls, sisters, standing barefoot at the edge of a county road just outside Harlan, Kentucky, holding hands like they were waiting for someone who never came. A truck driver named Earl Simmons saw them first. He said they didn't wave, didn't cry, just stared at him with eyes that looked, in his words, like they'd seen something God himself had turned away from. He radioed the sheriff. By noon, the whole town knew. The Dalton girls were back, and that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Because when they finally spoke, when they finally told the authorities what had happened to them in the 11 years they'd been missing, no one believed a word. Not the police, not the doctors, not even their own mother. And the reason no one believed them wasn't because their story was impossible. It was because it was too possible, too close, too real. The kind of truth that makes you realize the monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're sitting at the dinner table. They're your neighbors, your family, and sometimes they're you. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of what the Dalton girls admitted, and why, even now, more than 60 years later, most people still refuse to believe it. It was August 9th, 1952, a Saturday, the kind of hot, thick summer day in eastern Kentucky where the air sits on your chest like a wet towel, and even the dogs won't move from the shade. Margaret Dalton was 14. Her sister, Catherine, was 10. Their mother, Ruth, sent them into town that morning with a list and $3 folded in an envelope, eggs, flour, a bottle of aspirin. The walk was 2 miles. They'd done it 100 times before. By lunch, they should have been home. By dinner, Ruth was pacing the porch. By midnight, she was screaming their names into the woods behind the house, her voice cracking like dry wood. The sheriff's department organized a search the next morning. 30 men, dogs, volunteers from 3 counties. They combed the hills, dragged the creek, knocked on every door within 10 miles. Nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle. It was like the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. In small towns like Harlan, people talk. And when they talk long enough, the stories start to twist. Some said the girls had run away, that Margaret was pregnant, or wild, or both. Others whispered about drifters, about men who passed through town in the summer looking for work in the mines. A few of the older folks, the ones who still believed in things that didn't have names, said the girls had been taken by something that wasn't human at all. But Ruth Dalton didn't believe any of it. She knew her daughters. She knew they wouldn't run, and she knew, deep in the part of her that mothers know things, that wherever they were still alive. She was right, but she would spend the next 11 years wishing she'd been wrong. 11 years is a long time. Long enough for a town to forget, long enough for a mother to stop setting 2 extra plates at the table, long enough for the missing persons posters to fade and peel off the telephone poles like dead skin. By 1963, most people in Harlan had moved on. Ruth hadn't. She still kept their room the way it was. Still walked to the edge of the property every evening at dusk and stood there, waiting, like some kind of human lighthouse hoping to guide them home. And then, on September 24th, 1963, they came back. Not in pieces, not in a ditch, not as bodies pulled from a river. They walked out of the woods, hand in hand, wearing clothes that didn't fit and shoes that weren't theirs. Margaret was 25 now, Catherine was 21, but when Earl Simmons saw them on that road, he said they looked younger, smaller, like something inside them had stopped growing the day they disappeared. The sheriff brought them to the station first, protocol. They sat in a room with pale green walls and a table that wobbled, and for 3 hours they didn't say a word. Not to the officers, not to the doctor who checked them for injuries, not even to each other. Just sat there, holding hands, staring at nothing. It wasn't until Ruth arrived, until she fell to her knees in front of them and sobbed so hard she couldn't breathe, that Margaret finally spoke. She looked at her mother with eyes that had gone somewhere far away and said, "We stayed because he told us to." That was all. No explanation, no relief, just that one sentence, delivered in a voice so flat it didn't sound human. And when the police pressed her, when they asked who he was, where they'd been, why they'd come back now, Margaret looked at Catherine. Catherine nodded, and then they told a story that would haunt every person in that room for the rest of their lives. They said his name was Thomas. They didn't know his last name. Didn't know where he came from or how long he'd been watching them before that Saturday in August of 1952. Margaret said he'd been standing at the edge of the woods near the road, just standing there, smiling like he knew them, like they were expected. He wasn't tall, wasn't particularly strong-looking, just a man in his 40s with thinning hair and a face you'd forget the moment you looked away. That's what made it so easy, Margaret said. That's why they didn't run. He looked harmless. He looked like someone's uncle, someone's neighbor, someone you'd see at church and never think twice about. He told them their mother had been in an accident, that she'd sent him to fetch them, that they needed to come quickly, quietly, and not make a fuss. And because they were children, because they'd been raised to trust adults and obey and not ask too many questions, they followed him. Into the woods, down a trail that didn't exist on any map, to a place they would not leave for 11 years. He kept them in a house. That's what Catherine called it, though the way she described it, it sounded more like a tomb. It was buried, not underground, but hidden so deep in the hills, surrounded by so many trees and so much silence, that screaming would have been pointless. There were no neighbors, no roads, no way out that they could see. The doors locked from the outside. The windows were boarded, and Thomas, the man who had taken them, lived there too. He cooked for them, brought them clothes, taught them how to clean, how to sew, how to be quiet. He called them his daughters, made them call him father, and if they refused, if they cried or tried to leave or asked about their real mother, he would lock them in a room so small they couldn't stand up, couldn't lie down, couldn't do anything but sit in the dark and wait for him to decide they'd learned their lesson. Margaret said the longest she was ever in that room was 4 days. Catherine said she stopped counting after the first night. The police wanted details, dates, evidence, something concrete they could use to find this man, this house, this place that had swallowed 2 girls whole and spit them out 11 years later. But Margaret and Catherine couldn't give them that. They didn't know what year it was, most of the time. There were no calendars, no radio, no newspapers. Time didn't work the way it does for the rest of us. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. After a while, they said, you stop counting, you stop hoping, you just survive. And survival, in that house, meant becoming what Thomas wanted them to be. He had rules. So many rules. They had to wake at dawn, had to pray before every meal, thanking God for his mercy and Thomas for his provision. They weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to, weren't allowed to look out the windows or ask questions about the outside world. He told them the world had ended, that everyone they'd ever known was dead, that he had saved them, and if they ever left, they would die too. And for years, they believed him, because what choice did they have? Catherine said Thomas never touched them, not the way people assume when they hear a story like this. He didn't hurt them in that way, but he didn't have to. The control was enough. The isolation, the constant, suffocating presence of a man who had stolen their lives and convinced them it was love. He called it discipline, called it family, and in the twisted, nightmarish logic of that house, it almost made sense. Margaret said there were moments, long stretches of time, where she forgot she'd ever had another life, where Ruth's face became hard to remember, where the idea of escape seemed more frightening than staying, because, at least in that house, she knew the rules. At least she knew how to survive. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. The question everyone asked, the one the police couldn't let go of, was this. Why now? Why? After 11 years of captivity, did the Dalton girls suddenly walk out of those woods in September of 1963? Margaret's answer was simple, chilling, and somehow worse than anything she'd said before. She said Thomas told them to leave. That one morning, without warning, without explanation, he unlocked the front door, handed them each a pair of shoes, and said it was time. He didn't say why, didn't say where he was going or if he'd ever come back. Just told them to walk east until they found a road. and then keep walking until someone stopped. He kissed them both on the forehead, called them good girls, and then he disappeared into the woods, and they never saw him again. Catherine said she didn't understand at first, didn't know if it was a test, if he was watching from the trees, waiting to see if they'd run so he could punish them for it. But Margaret took her hand, and they walked. For hours, until the trees thinned and the road appeared and Earl Simmons' truck came rattling around the bend. The police launched an investigation immediately. They sent search teams into the hills, brought in dogs, helicopters. They interviewed everyone in Harlan and the surrounding counties, looking for anyone who matched Thomas's description or knew of an isolated house in the woods. They found nothing. No house, no man, no evidence that any of it had ever existed. The areas the girls described didn't match any known trails or properties. The timelines didn't add up. And the more the authorities dug, the more holes appeared in the story. Margaret couldn't remember if the house had one floor or two. Catherine said there were chickens, but Margaret didn't remember chickens. They couldn't agree on which direction they'd walked or how long it had taken. And when pressed, when investigators tried to nail down specifics, both girls would go silent, shut down, stare at the floor like they were somewhere else entirely. Within 2 weeks, the case went cold. Within a month, people started to whisper, started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the Dalton girls were lying. The official report, filed in November of 1963, concluded that Margaret and Catherine Dalton had likely run away in 1952 and fabricated the story of their captivity to avoid judgment or legal consequences. The psychological evaluations were inconclusive. One doctor said they showed signs of severe trauma consistent with prolonged abuse. Another said they exhibited symptoms of shared delusion, a rare condition where two people reinforce each other's false memories until neither can separate truth from fiction. The local newspaper ran a small piece suggesting the girls had been living rough, possibly with drifters or in abandoned mining camps, and had invented Thomas to explain away 11 years they were too ashamed to account for. Ruth Dalton never spoke to a reporter again. She brought her daughters home, and they lived quietly in that house on the edge of Harlan for the rest of their lives. Margaret never married, never left town. Catherine tried once, moved to Lexington in 1967, but came back within 6 months. People who knew them said they were polite but strange, that they kept to themselves, that sometimes, late at night, you could see them standing together in the yard, holding hands, staring at the tree line like they were expecting someone. Margaret died in 2004. Cancer. Catherine followed 3 years later. Heart failure. Neither ever changed their story. In the decades after 1963, they were interviewed twice by journalists and once by a graduate student writing a thesis on unsolved disappearances in Appalachia. Every time, they said the same thing. Thomas was real. The house was real. And whatever reason people had for not believing them, it had nothing to do with the truth. Maybe that's what makes this story so disturbing. Not that 2 girls were taken. Not even that they were held for 11 years by a man whose name no one could verify and whose house no one could find. It's that when they came back, when they finally had the chance to be heard, no one wanted to listen, because believing them meant accepting that something like this could happen, that a man could steal 2 children, hide them in plain sight, and vanish without a trace. That evil doesn't always leave evidence, doesn't always make sense, and sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones we refuse to believe. Not because they're impossible, but because they're too close to the truth we live with every day. The case remains open, technically, but no one's looking anymore. No one except the people who heard this story and can't stop thinking about it. The ones who wonder, late at night, if maybe Thomas is still out there, still watching, still waiting, and if somewhere, in some other town, in some other decade, there are 2 more girls who walked into the woods and never came back. At least, not in a way anyone would believe.